So we're nearing the end of the Crime in the Media Film Festival. Um, and this is a topic I usually do because everybody gets so sick of talking about how the media distorts things. And we've hit that theme over and over again. So this is sort of an opportunity to take a film that was popular in the 90s, but I think does a fair job capturing some of the elements in a mainstream theory of crime, and that social disorganization theory. And the other reason I like to show it is because it also is a really good tie-in to talk about race and crime, which a lot of folks neglect to do. Sort of neglect to take it head on. So that's the point of doing this. So in terms of setup, social disorganization theory is one of our oldest sort of sociological theories set in the United States. And the context is it takes hold in the University of Chicago. In a context where most people when they're thinking about crime are either blaming the city, so city populations are exploding. Chicago, in the early 1800s was thousands of people. By 1870, it's over 1 million, and then a couple decades later, it's 2 million. So you have these cities that are just exploding in population, and as you might expect, crime um, tends to explode along with it. And so there's this belief that there's something corrupting and bad and horrible about big cities versus small towns. Um, the other prevailing theory is that the more recent brands of immigrants are somehow less intelligent, less moral um, than previous generations. And so, you know, it's the idea, if you've ever seen the old signs of Irish need not apply, that the belief is that these new immigrants pouring into the cities are a big cause of crime. It's a similar argument that you hear people make about Black and Hispanic Americans now. And it's part of the reason I talk about this theory. So, sociologists in the University of Chicago, it was the first sociology program in the U.S., start to kind of go into the city and study the city sort of as a social unit. They start to think about how and why parts of a city might generate certain pathologies. And the kind of starting point for social disorganization is this side theory, this theory of how cities grow and expand. And the idea is that cities tend to expand from a center outward. So if you imagine throwing a rock into a pond and these ripples sort of going out, that at the center are these industrial zones, heavy factory, textile mills, meatpacking plants, those sorts of things. And what happens when a city grows is they expand out and they start to eat up these other zones where people where had been primarily residential zones. The people who had worked in these factories lived just outside of them. Well, now you have sort of mixed use zones. Um, and the belief was that in this sort of zone in transition is where you found all sorts of social ills. That was the highest infant mortality rate, highest incidence of mental disorders, and they believe crime. Um, the first people to kind of connect this theory with crime in a scientific way was these researchers that were next to the University of Chicago. Um, and what they did is they got the addresses of delinquents who had been formally petitioned to court. So all the delinquents went to court, had their address. They just mapped the addresses. And what they found, and they did this using a variety. They went from court records to police contact reports to other stuff. And they did it over decades in their career. You can see up here from 42 to 72 was the publication of this book right here. And what they found was that the same neighborhoods had high rates of crime, and that those high rates survived. If you think about Chicago during this time, you have wave after wave of different flavors of immigrants, Irish, Polish, blacks from the South, and as they go through these zones, when they move out, the crime stays back. And so the idea of an inferior immigrant is hard to sustain when groups of immigrants move out of the area and the crime stays in the area. New immigrants move in, they have crime. Um, so the theory became it's not about the people, it's more about the place. And the place became not the city, but certain neighborhoods in a city that surround the central business zone. And so then the next step becomes, well, why? What can we say about those neighborhoods? And from census data, they could kind of glean what these neighborhoods look like. That you had a lot of population turnover, right? People moved in because it was a cheap place to live. It was next to the factories. They saved up money. They moved out. People moved around from apartment to apartment versus people that owned houses and stayed in the same place a long time. A lot of heterogeneity, different sorts of folks forced to kind of live near each other, speaking different languages, having different cultures. And then you had the physical decay and poverty in the neighborhoods. The question is, how do all these things, these properties of a neighborhood, produce crime? And their answer was, what happens is that in these sorts of neighborhoods, that communities lack a cohesion and trust, and therefore they can't kind of police themselves. They can't squash out the disorder and make order. So the assumption here is that unless a neighborhood sort of actively polices itself, crime is going to crop up. It's like a garden, right? Unless you actively care for the garden, weeds are going to crop up and sort of ruin your vegetables. So you go back and think about these things, right? If people are constantly moving in and out, and you don't know your neighbor, and your neighbor doesn't look like you and act like you, and maybe speak the same language as you, you're unlikely to trust and interact with them, and you're unlikely to sort of step out and help prevent disorder. So, and the most common example is, you know, kids that look like they're up to no good. Are you willing to go out there and say, "Hey, I know your neighbor. I know, or I know your parents. I know where you live. Get the hell out of here. Stop doing what you're doing. Why aren't you in school?" Um, that sort of small stuff has a role in increasing crime. The other idea was that once crime got rooted in a neighborhood, these sort of delinquent traditions and values, in its most formal way, gangs, but short of gangs, like the values that condone crime and violence start to emerge and take root as well, and those get passed on. Um, so, for a variety of reasons, and we don't need to get into all of them, that this theory sort of fell out of favor for a long time. This became the critical thing that we can measure this stuff pretty easy from census data, but we didn't have a really good way to measure this in neighborhoods. Like, you can't interview a neighborhood, and there's no neighborhood level data that measures this stuff. And so people said, well, yeah, this stuff's related to crime, but you can't really test the theory. And it got rekindled in the 80s and 90s in part because we had another big spike in black on black violence that sort of called out for an explanation, and in part because research was able to kind of connect these dots between the ecological factors and crime. And so the sort of critical article came out in the late 80s, and ironically used something called the British Crime Survey. So it used data from Great Britain, and the reason it used that data is because the Brits, when they collected data from a neighborhood level sample. So they basically got a random sample of neighborhoods, and then within those neighborhoods, they picked a certain number of people. And what that allowed these guys to do was to say, all right, if everybody responds to a question saying, I'm willing to go out and confront kids that look like they're up to no good. If everybody in the neighborhood answers that, you can sort of add it up and divide, and you can get a neighborhood level measure, like on average, what percent of residents are willing to go out and do that. And you can get that for every neighborhood. And so because of the way the survey was organized, they could get these neighborhood levels of social control, the willingness of residents to sort of look after each other and supervise their neighborhood. What they found is that they could connect the dots, that these ecological things did predict social control, and social control did predict crime. And their measure of crime wasn't official data, it was victimization. So they asked people in the past 6 months, have you been a victim of X, Y, or Z crime? So this is a big turning point in terms of how we were able to test the theory. Subsequently, and this is the article that's on Moodle, Sampson and a bunch of his colleagues replicated these results in Chicago. Huge study with a big long acronym that I can no longer remember. The study, I can't remember it. It's in the article. So again, what they found is very similar. They coined this new term, collective efficacy, and the idea is they started out with these two variables. One measured how willing people in the neighborhood were to exercise control, tell kids to quiet down, that sort of stuff. The other was how much do people trust each other and how much are we willing to help each other. Practically, what they found is that these two things were so related, so correlated that it didn't make sense to have two separate measures. So they combined them to this measure of collective efficacy. So this means neighbors that know each other, trust each other, and therefore are willing to act on each other's behalf. Again, the key was they found that collective efficacy was the linchpin that connected the properties of the neighborhood, poverty, residential mobility, those sorts of things, and crime. So they're measures of collective efficacy. Out here they talk about residents were asked, how likely is it that you were to intervene if children were skipping school and hanging out at a street corner, spray painting graffiti? All right, so this is the active social control measure. The trust measure, cohesion measure was talking about people around here are willing to help their neighbors. This is a close-knit neighborhood. And so it's these two things together that make up collective efficacy. So, as I said, what they found is this ecological characteristics of neighborhood, residential stability, concentrated disadvantage, which is poverty and some other stuff, unemployment, had an impact on collective efficacy, which in turn had an impact on all three measures of crime that they had. So, if you want to look at the math magic, you have to use pretty complex math for this because you're talking about controlling the effects of individual people, right? And neighborhood level characteristics. And so to do that, the social composition is the individual people. So if you interview people and they're crime prone, they're going to have effect on crime. The collective efficacy is what happens independent of that. So it's not a bad apple, it's a bad place sort of theory. And so what you see in these models is that concentration disadvantage has an impact on homicide, violent victimization, and perceived neighborhood violence, all three measures, collective efficacy. And so these t-values are all significant, which is, if you understand the math, that means that they predict crime independent of these other things. So what you should see happen if this model works right is that once you add collective efficacy to the model, that these other things should go down as well, right? So the reason this is related to crime is the reason these things are related to crime is because of collective efficacy. And so you see, without collective efficacy, we can cheat. Look at the t-values. High t-values mean stronger relationships. So 13, 2, and 6, and when you add collective efficacy, they go down to 7, 1, and 3.49. And so that's how you arrive at this chart. Where I lost my chart. That's how you arrive at this chart, being able to say this causes this, which causes this. The other sort of thing that happens then is that this is the social control part that because neighbors look after each other and trust each other and help each other, they're able to prevent, kids from hanging out on the street corner, graffiti from taking over neighborhood. They maintain order. They help reduce serious crime. The other part of that theory was that you have these, once sort of crime embeds in the neighborhood, you get these values that support crime. And there's a variety of different ways to think about it. William Julius Wilson is famous for this idea of concentrated poverty and talking about the underclass or the truly disadvantaged. That one of the things that's happened in the past 50 years is that those neighborhoods that are most crime prone have become more isolated. We built interstate highways around them. People don't walk through the neighborhoods anymore. There's no sort of integration of folks from different neighborhoods. And so in that sort of cultural vacuum with no mainstream role models and all sorts of violence, you get these sort of what we view as warped or twisted values, that violence becomes normative, that you have this hyper-materialism, that people get about sneakers or coats or starter jackets or whatever it is that in that particular era. Um, Anderson, same thing. He talks about what he calls the code of the streets, that respect and disrespect or dissing somebody takes on exaggerated meaning or importance. That something like maintaining eye contact too long with somebody can be the cause of getting your ass beat, um, and that in part that stems from a sort of lack of normative ways to gain respect through employment and through other mainstream avenues. Sampson and Wilson talk about, again, these are all related, cognitive landscape. And you see this very clearly in the movie, at least I think, in the Boyz n the Hood movie, that, if you grow up in a neighborhood that's rife with violence, that you see people get the shit kicked out of each other, that you see a dead body on the street, that sort of what's normal to you is different than what's normal to somebody who grows up in a different sort of neighborhood. And so it's not that you condone violence; it's that you sort of expect a certain level of violence, and that's sort of normal in your neighborhood. And that has an impact on how people behave. Um, so, as I said at the start of this, part of the importance to me is to tie it all into race and ethnicity. I think the tendency as human beings is to see crime and you see people and you say, well, bad person caused crime because that's the sort of most direct, most common sense explanation. It's harder to see the context. Um, and so it is true that race and crime are related to each other in the United States. I'll give you one stark example. I think blacks make up 13% of the population and account for almost half of the homicides as offenders. Um, and it's not that black people are shooting white people, it's that black people by and large are shooting each other. Um, and so that goes for most serious violent crime. And so if you look at incarceration rates for whites, at the top of my head, I think are 400, 500 per 100,000, and for blacks, it's like 3,000 some per 100,000. And the issue is, well, how do you arrive there with our prison so black? Part of the reason is black Americans are more likely to commit serious violent crime, at least in prison. Part of the reason is other stuff, right? Our war on drugs and how we police neighborhoods is related to race and income and inequality. And so if you pour a bunch of police into these high crime neighborhoods, which we do, they're going to pull more people over. They're going to search more people, find drugs and other stuff. They're going to make more arrests. So, I mean, it's a complex issue, but part of the core is that there is higher crime. And so that leads to why. And Sampson and most criminologists probably believe the same thing, that it's not race per se, that there's nothing about being black or being Hispanic that automatically causes you to flip out and be more crime prone. But in the United States, black and Hispanic, especially Mexican Americans, are sort of the main characters in most inner city neighborhoods. This is all, I just stumble on my language because this is all the stuff I meant to put up when I talked about it last. So, as an example for homicide, this is from a speech Robert Sampson gave, that he was looking at the most recent data. So, in a half a year in 2012, almost all the homicides were black, and almost all the victims were black, despite the fact that they made up 32% of the city population. So, this idea of racial invariance is what I just got done talking about, the belief that blacks, whites, and Hispanics who all experience the same context would probably all have the same crime rate. But it's the difference is in the context and neighborhood and those sorts of factors that influence crime. So the answer to why do we see these racial differences is why do blacks have high crime rates? Well, blacks live in the same neighborhoods that have experienced high crime rates no matter who lived there. When Irish lived there, they had high crime rates. When the Germans lived there, they had crime rates. So the next question is, why were Irish and Polish and other immigrants able to sort of start in the zone and transition and get the hell out and reduce the crime rates for their ethnicity? Why weren't blacks able to do the same thing? And There's a variety of reasons for that. One is that public policy wise, we kind of made matters worse, trying to do good. We created these projects, and this is the other Moodle article in there, the Tower article, talking about the rise and fall of these housing projects. They were built to provide housing initially for um, white inner city residents and later black inner city residents. And what they did is sort of instead of having disadvantage and poverty and inequality that was spread out in the city, they concentrated it in these little small pockets, which made it easier to avoid. And then we built interstates around them, and so part of what we did is we really isolated these areas. Um, the second issue is that there's a fair amount of housing discrimination and segregation that happened in the prior to the 1970s. Um, And so blacks who saved up enough money weren't allowed to move out because nobody would sell them a house in their neighborhood. And so you had this buildup of blacks in these areas. The other thing is we sort of lost the manufacturing base that allowed past generations of immigrants to move out. So all those factories that people worked at to save the money to buy the houses disappeared. Um, and so, they moved to other countries. They moved out into more rural areas, but they moved out of inner city. And finally, once housing segregation broke up and lawsuits were successful and blacks were able to move out, we had interrupted this natural process for so long that when the doors opened, it was like boom. It wasn't a natural transition anymore. It was this vacuum created by all the black families who could move out, getting the hell out. And so what was left behind was sort of poor and more disorganized than anything we've seen. Um, so um, what do you do? One of the sort of frustrating things about this theory is that it tells you a lot about what generates crime, but it also tells you that most of the things we do are probably not going to work very well. Um, the simplest explanation or the simplest sort of policy is this neighborhood watch, right? Like we will create this artificial social control. We'll have people meet and monitor their neighborhood and do the stuff that happens organically in better, more integrated neighborhoods. Um, the problem is, if you drive around a city and look for neighborhood watch signs, you tend to see them in the better neighborhoods. Why? Because those are the neighborhoods where people know each other and trust each other, and they're willing to have the meetings and have captains and so on and so forth. These things don't take root very well in neighborhoods that are poor, that there's more mobility, and that people have less of an interest. And the frustrating thing is the theory would tell you that, right? That for the same reasons collective efficacy is going to happen naturally, it's going to be harder to sort of impose it artificially. Um, Sampson himself, who's sort of the guru in this area, has basically said, we should be in the business of trying to increase any kind of nonprofit organizations where people meet each other and get to know each other and trust each other, and they become more intertwined. So churches, um, athletic organizations, school organizations, that those are the sorts of things that help build actual collective efficacy. Um, the other thing you can do is sort of try to address the sort of root ecological things that ruin collective efficacy. So concentrated poverty, residential mobility, family disruption, sort of. So that's the point of that Tower article. That is it urban renewal or is it gentrification? We go into these neighborhoods. In the Chicago one that's on the start of the slideshow, that's the in the tower. And by the way, if you've ever read a book a lot of people sign called Gang Leader for a Day, uh, he is in that same context as the tower. He's in those units that's talked about in that article. It's a sociologist who goes and wanders, an Indian American sociologist who goes wanders into a black neighborhood and starts to hang out with the gang members that are living in the projects in these neighborhoods. Anyhow, so what happens in the Chicago plan? The idea, and they followed from other plans, was to demolish all these high-rise complexes and build in their place a mix of privately owned homes, partially subsidized townhouses, and fully subsidized housing. And the issue is, right, if you take out like 10,000 people that are living there and you only provide 2,000 people fully subsidized housing, where are those other people going to go? And so critics have said this is basically a land grab. The land has become more valuable again because um, millennials want to live back in the city. They want to live in these neighborhoods, and so suddenly, instead of the suburbs having all the highly desired housing and lots, now the inner city has them again. So Chicago's going to be an interesting test. Obviously, there's a lot of flaws in the plan if you read that article, but it's going to be interesting to see 10 years from now what these neighborhoods look like and what crime looks like generally. Um, God, I got to get better at changing these slides. So this is everything I just talked about. And so they talk about in Boys in the Hood, they talk about Furious, one of the main characters, talked about gentrification, and so that's the sort of the dark side of urban renewal is this idea of gentrification that you sort of boot out the poor black residents that are living there so that wealthier white people can have better housing. Um, there's also going to be, and you get this in that Towers article, issues when you mix people that have traditionally lived in these very poor neighborhoods that are used to and tolerant of more deviance with people who are not tolerant of that. Um, and so as people try to impose social control in the neighborhood, there's going to be resistance. And so you're going to get those sort of problems as well. Um, so again, the big point is that social disorganization is a theory of places and not people. It's a theory at the macro level, like why do some neighborhoods have high crime rates? Um, and so we tend to, as I said, look at crime and look at people and say, oh, that bad dude committed that bad crime without sort of seeing a larger context. And it's hard to understand. But this is the theory that sort of backs up and said, look, almost everybody that's lived in these neighborhoods has had kids that have very high rates of violence. Why is that? And so it encourages us to think about the place as opposed to the people. So things to watch in the film: see if you can see the social disorganization. The ecological factors in the neighborhood that these kids grow up in should be pretty obvious, but look for them. The lack of informal control. Are kids allowed to hang out in the street corner and drink and sell drugs and do other stuff? And then these sort of cognitive landscape issues about what kids think are normal. Well, and the great one for that I use in Intro to Crim is that they're walking along the train tracks to go see the dead body. And they're talking about their dads, what kind of guns their dads own, and going to see a dead body as if that's normal, and these attitudes that they have towards violence. And finally, what we just got done talking about, this discussion of what happens when these neighborhoods flip in this process of urban renewal. All right, so that's what we have for that film and this topic.